We've finally made it back to Nashville. We're here in our residential kitchen and we're ready to start using ingredients that we have sourced from around the world. Today we're going to be using rose petals that we picked up at Italy in Boston. Italian rose petals to be exact. To use sugar, pectin, the rose petals, water, rose water, and lemon. This is obviously not a baked good, but I thought it would be a great place to get our feet wet by making something that's relatively simple, and we will use it as a companion for a bake that we'll do later today, which will be scones. I'd like to use the best quality ingredients that are available to me. And I find that this raw cane sugar is just a step above plain white granulated sugar. Of course, there's no reason why you can't use plain sugar, but I find this gives a little bit more depth of flavor. We need pectin because there is absolutely no pectin in rose petals, sugar, or lemon. So, well, actually there's a little bit of pectin in lemon, but not enough to gel the jelly. And of course our rose petals and water. Now these are Italian rose petals, so I've selected an Italian water. That's just a crazy thing that I like to do. Whatever my main ingredient is, I like to have the water that corresponds with it. So if I'm making French croissants, I'm using French water. I know that sounds a little bit extra, but that's the nomadic baker, extra. Rose water, and of course organic lemons. Forward. We need a heavy bottom saucepan, a measuring cup that has milliliters, not cups. Remember, the nomadic baker only uses metric measurements. We'll need some empty bowls, a scale, and mason jars. Let's talk a little bit about the mason jars. This recipe that we're going to use today makes roughly about a pint of jelly, and I'm going to break it down into smaller bottles because I'm going to give some of it away. Rose jelly is very, very potent. You don't need a lot of it, and it's not everybody's cup of tea. It's wonderful on biscuits and scones, but it also is fantastic as a condiment on lamb and sometimes fish and chicken, depending on what you're going to use it for. Now, we've gone way off track because obviously this isn't anything that we're going to bake. And as I said earlier, we're going to start small and fast and relatively easy. This is a silicone spatula. I have a series of metal spoons, and I have something to ladle my finished jelly out with into the mason jars. I have a citrus reamer and a knife to cut. Now you'll notice that other than the silicone, you're not really seeing anything other than metal, because when I am making jellies and jams, I don't like to use plastic because it can melt in the hot jelly. I don't like to use wood because flavors that have been previously used on those wood utensils can get into the jelly. So I like everything to be, for the most part, sterilized. So that is also a very important topic, is sterilization. These mason jars have been sterilized, and you'll notice that I put the lids on them. I did that because I didn't want to touch the inside now that they have been sterilized. I did these in boiling water earlier off camera, but you can certainly do these in a dishwasher as long as you don't use a rinse aid in the dishwasher. And I'm going to go over first the measurements that we'll be using for this recipe. I have here 100 grams of sugar. I have 2 tablespoons of pectin. And as we talked about earlier, we're going to need 15 grams of rose petals. And again, we'll sort through these on camera so that you can see exactly what we need to do to get out the thorns. And we have our 250 milligrams of water. We have 1 tablespoon of lemon juice and 1 tablespoon of the rose water. So I have decided to use the granulated pectin so that I can easily mix it into the sugar. And I'm just going to take a wire whisk, and I'm going to whisk that together until it's really well combined. And the reason that I'm doing this is, if you were to just dump the pectin into the water, it would clump and you would end up with a very lumpy jelly. So this way here, I'm able to get it fully incorporated before I drop it into the water. I already know that I don't have the 15 grams of rose petals that I'll need for this recipe. And these are a more affordable version of these hand-selected rose petals. These were selected by machine, and therefore it has a little bit of rose hip, and I can even see a thorn right there. So obviously we don't want that in our jelly. And let's just dump a little bit of this out. We won't need this whole bag. But you can see here we've got a leaf, and that looks to be the bottom of a rose hip, and it's got leaves attached to it. Here's another rose hip, and I don't see any thorns, but we certainly have stems. So what we want here is just the rose petals. Here's another rose hip. You could go through with a knife and peel that off, but I think that this was 99 cents for these rose petals, and in a polar opposite, these were $20. So what we have here is almost sorted through, and this is what we'd want to use for the jelly, but the more I pick through it, the more I see little thorns, and so you'll really want to pay close attention. Now, as a comparison, let's take a look at these hand-picked. Look at the color difference in them. They're more vibrant in color. And of course, these are the Italian rose petals, and these were most likely sourced in northern Mexico. So they'll taste virtually identical, but this will certainly make a lovelier jelly. Okay, it's time to go, but one of the first things that I need to do is I'm going to take a ceramic plate, can be any plate, but a glass or ceramic plate, and I'm going to pop this into my freezer. This is how we're going to do the viscosity test. As the jelly cooks, I'll periodically take this out of the freezer and put a drop or two down onto the freezing cold plate, and then we'll get to see exactly how thick the jelly will be once it cools down. So I'm going to pop that into the freezer. And now we're going to take our water. Remember, 250 milliliters of water. This is our 100 grams of sugar and our 2 tablespoons of pectin that were pre-mixed together. And then I'm going to take my rose petals, and before I put them down there, I'm just going to muddle them a little bit. Just bruise up the petals just a little bit before I dump them in. And then I'm going to stir that up to combine. Again, I'm using this silicone whisk so that I don't scratch the bottom of this pan. Okay, that's mixed together pretty well. And then I'm going to put the heat on. I'm going to start it at medium heat. And I'm going to bring this to a high simmer. When we get to that point, we'll come back with a close-up so that you can see exactly what's going on inside of the pan. It's been about 2 minutes since I turned the heat on. You can see that the rose petals have turned a really vibrant shade of fuchsia. You can see just along the edges that the sugar pectin water mixture is beginning to boil. I'm going to decrease the temperature to medium-low, and I'm going to let that come to a rolling boil for 10 minutes. During that time, the rose petals are going to turn a really unsightly brown color, but you'll get to see a magic trick when we drop the lemon juice in. The sugar, water, pectin, and roses are just about to come to a boil, and you can see that the color is already starting to dull. Around the edges, you can see that it's turning a tannish brown color, and we're going to boil this now at a rolling boil for 10 minutes. But just before it comes to a full boil, we're going to drop the lemon juice in. We're going to give that a stir, and that will most likely start to bring back the pretty rose color. We have just passed the 5-minute boiling mark, and as you can see, it is turning such a beautiful, beautiful shade of red. So we've got about 5 minutes left to go, and then we'll take it off and move on to the next step. I've got my chilled plate out of the freezer. I'm going to get a placemat here so I can put that down. Turn the heat off. The color is so vibrant, but what we need to do is take about 1/4 teaspoon of the liquid itself, and we're going to drop it onto the plate, and we're going to wait for about 30 seconds. Now, while we wait for our viscosity test, I'm going to talk just a little bit about the jelly itself. I did notice that we have some leaves in there. The leaves are perfectly edible, so I have the option of straining it, which I may do. I haven't quite decided yet. If you strain it, you will end up with a lot less than the pint that is in here. So it's been 30 seconds. So what we're going to do is we're just going to touch it, and if it wrinkles, it's ready. And if it runs all the way down the plate, it's not. I see a little bit of wrinkling. It could probably stand another minute at high boil. So what I'm going to do is put it right back onto the stove again. I'm going to bring it back to a high boil, let it go for 1 minute, and then we'll test it one more time, and then we'll make a decision on whether or not we're going to strain it or if we're going to leave it whole for a jam. Okay, it had been at a rolling boil again for a minute, so we're going to yet again, we're going to take about 1/4 teaspoon, and we're going to drop it onto the plate. And we're going to wait the 30 seconds, and you can see how beautifully it's all come together. And I have made the decision to not strain it. I was set up here to strain everything into this white pan, but I've made the decision that the rose petals have broken down enough, and though I do see a couple little stems here and there, for example, there is a little tip of a leaf. And as I said before, the leaves are entirely edible. But if you want a more refined jelly or jam, you'd want to kind of pick that out. All right, 30 seconds have passed, and now we're going to test. And there it is. We have a wrinkle when we push on it. It doesn't go everywhere, so we know our jam is ready. All right, we are ready to go to get everything into the mason jars, but before we do that, we need to do the final flavoring process, which is adding the rose water in. On its own, the jam is going to be tart. A lot of people describe it as very similar to cranberry sauce. It has that tart flavor of cranberry, but it also has the floral undertones to it that make it such a beautiful jam. So I'm going to take the 1 tablespoon of rose water, and I'm going to, with my metal spoon, I'm just going to stir it about. Now, you don't really want to add any more than a tablespoon because it will thin the jam out. That's not what we want. So now that I've got that mixed in, you can see there are 1 or 2 stems in there. I'm just going to get rid of those. I'm just going to quickly look through it and pick out what I can. And there's a couple of leaves in there, but that's not really going to hurt anything as long as we don't have, 1 or 2 grams of stems and leaves. So what I'll do now is get my ladle. We do want that to stay sterile. And I am going to get that right up to the first line. Oops, I got a little bit on the edge, but again, don't want to touch that with my fingers. We can clean that off with a paper towel after. I'll do 1 more. This jar looks even better than the last one because I don't see any stems in it. So we should get 2 of these half-pint jars out of this recipe Because I'm going to keep one and give the other one away, I am not going to can these, meaning I'm not going to process them for long-term storage. You can put the lid on now and the heat from within will vacuum it. This will last about a month in the refrigerator just the way it is. Of course, if you're going to keep it any longer or if you're going to double or triple the recipe to make more, you'll certainly want to can it. But now that this is done, we'll cap it and let it cool completely, then we'll refrigerate it, and it will be the perfect accompaniment to the scones that we will make later today. Let's talk about the equipment that we'll need to make our scones. There's not a lot that's needed. Some of these things are not 100% necessary, but they do make things a little bit easier. We'll need a digital scale to weigh our ingredients. This is a bench scraper. This is a flexible plastic one. An ordinary kitchen fork, a box grater, wire whisk, a knife, a microplane, a pastry cutter, which looks almost identical to a pizza cutter because here's a little secret. It is a mixing bowl, a cookie sheet, and parchment paper that we'll use to line. I also use a little bit of parchment paper when I'm grating out the butter so that it doesn't make, first, a huge mess, and second, I'm able to easily transfer that right into the flour. But you'll get to see all of that coming up next when we mix our scones. Let's begin. To start, we have our 80 grams of granulated sugar, and we're going to get our lemon zest into the sugar. I'm going to use my microplane here. This is a fine grate, and we're just going to begin by grating into the sugar. Now you'll notice here, I'm not pushing too hard. I just want to get just the yellow peel. Everything underneath is called the pith, and it is very bitter. We just want the edge of the peel so that we don't get any bitter inside of the sugar. Now, we won't be using the juice today. You could make a glaze from the juice with some confectioner's sugar, but we're going to be using the vanilla sugar. All right, there's one. And let's get our second one going. Okay, we now have our 2 lemon zests inside, and I'm just going to use a fork to kind of mash that about. And then once we get it incorporated, we're going to switch to using our fingers. We want this to be like coarse, wet sand. And using your fingers will really help to distribute the natural oils in the lemon zest. And you can see that's already coming together to look like a wet sand. Once you have that done, looks like I've got it all picked up here. We'll just set that aside. This butter has been in the freezer for about an hour. I have a sharp knife and my box grater. This box grater has a slicing side, a very fine grate, a medium grate, and a large grate. I am going to use the large grate, and standing it up, I'm going to grate about 3/4 of this stick. You'll note that I am doing it right on top of a scrap piece of parchment paper. That will make it easier to transfer later into the actual flour mixture. It's much easier to handle the butter when it's frozen, and of course you couldn't grate it if it was room temperature. We are just about to get to about a quarter of a stick left. Let's see what we have. Beautiful frozen shreds of butter. Make sure you get all of that buttery goodness out. And then for the last quarter of a stick, we're going to cut it into pea-sized pieces. This is rock hard frozen butter. This is a pretty sharp knife. And then just pea-sized cubes. The reason that we are going to do two different sizes of butter, the grated and the pea size, is so that we get varying textures of flake and crumb inside of the scone. So as you can see, we have our frozen large shreds and our pea-sized pieces. Now, if this seems like it's getting too soft and it's not frozen any longer, you can pop this back into the freezer for another 5 to 10 minutes just to refreeze it. You wouldn't want to go any longer than 10 minutes or it will be too difficult to get it inside of the flour mixture, which we'll do next. We are ready to move on to incorporating the dry ingredients. I have first our flour, and then the prepared lemon sugar. And before I put any more dry ingredients in, I'm just going to whisk that to sift it together. Whisking together dry ingredients is just about the same as sifting it together. But because we put the lemon zest in, it wouldn't run through a sifter, so I'm going to use this whisk. Now we're going to put in our kosher salt, our baking powder, and our baking soda. Let's get that all whisked together. And now it's time to get our butter incorporated into the flour mixture. I'm just going to dump everything in there. And if it gets stuck to the parchment paper, you just use a bench scraper that we talked about in the equipment clip. Set that aside. Now, with our bare hands, we're going to massage the butter into the dry ingredients. And this is where you'll see the grates come together differently from the pea-sized pieces that we cut. Now, I've worked pretty quickly here. You don't want your butter to become room temperature and soft. Mine is still very hard, but still just enough pliable where it can get incorporated into the dry ingredients. If before you start mixing the butter into the flour, you notice that the butter has started to soften, you can easily pop the grates and the little pea-sized pieces back into the freezer for about 10 to 15 minutes just to get them rock hard again. Now, what we're looking for are uniform pieces that clump together and stay together. So you can see that's not quite ready yet. And these are quite large, so I'm going to break those up and just squeezing them between my fingers and getting all of the flour incorporated into that butter. Sometimes the best way to do it is by just running it between your hands, and every few seconds or so just clump it together and see if it stays together. It's just about there. I like to clump together about a small lemon size worth or a little fistful and see if it stays together. Oh, look at that, stays together. Let's make sure we got the edges there too. Nope, that's not quite there. Now, we had talked about in the equipment clip about pastry blenders and forks. This is a pastry blender. You'll see that it has these somewhat sharp blades on it. And a lot of people like to use this, but I find that it clumps too much in between the blades when making scones and biscuits. And that is why I like to use my hands. Let's see where we are now. Do we stay together? We stay together. So now that we have everything incorporated, just go through and inspect that you don't have any giant clumps of butter. And I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about 7 pieces of butter that are a little bit larger than that pea size. So we are good to go. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to make a well in the center of the flour mixture. And that is going to be where we put our icy cold cream. We are ready to move on to incorporating the wet ingredients into the dry ingredients. But to do that, we'll need to mix all of the wet ingredients together first. Now, I had the heavy cream chilling in the refrigerator in its glass container so that it's icy cold. I have 1 egg that I'm going to crack directly into that heavy cream, and 1 tablespoon of the rose water. Now, the reason I'm using rose water instead of the lemon extract, and remember, if you are going to use lemon extract, only use all natural, don't use anything artificial, or your scones will taste artificial. But I'm using the rose water because I thought it would be a great way to incorporate the rose flavor to coordinate with the rose jam that we made earlier this morning. So now that we've got the rose water, the cream, and the egg in the same container, we're just going to whisk that together with a fork just so that it's all combined. And of course, if you don't have rose water and you don't have lemon extract, there's no reason why you can't use vanilla extract. But we're being a little extra here today, as we always are here at the Nomadic Baker. I've worked pretty quickly to make sure that the butter doesn't get too soft and that the cream mixture stays nice and cold. So what we'll do is we're going to pour all of the liquid into the center of that well, and then using a fork, we're just going to pull in around the edges and start mixing. Now, this is a very wet dough, and what you need to know that is most important is you don't want to overwork this dough. I've got almost all of the flour from the edges pulled into the center, and I'm going to use my dough scraper now to pick up the rest. I'm doing this with a very light hand because I just don't want to overwork the dough. We just want it to come together. That looks exactly the way it's supposed to. When we come back, we'll have our work surface dusted with flour, and we'll turn it out and put our additions into the scone dough. Before we move on to turning out this dough, I'd like to talk about what you would need to do if the dough was too wet or too dry. If the dough is too dry, you would want to add in 1 tablespoon of heavy cream into it just to get it to this consistency where it's just tacky to the touch. And on the flip side, if your dough is too wet, you would want to put in 1 tablespoon of flour and work that in again just until it's tacky. But this came out perfectly. So what we'll do is we're going to dust the work surface very, very thoroughly. And we're just going to plop out that dough onto that floured surface. It is very sticky. Your hands are going to get really dirty, but what we're going to do now is we're just going to flour our fingers, and we're going to push that dough out. Let's flip it over, and we're going to add in our blueberries. Now, it may not take the full 100 grams of blueberries, but what we'll do is we're going to scatter that out, and then we're just going to flip up the edges. Give that another dusting. We're being pretty liberal here with the flour because we don't want it to stick. And then we're going to push that out one more time. I think we can get all 100 grams of blueberries in. They'll just be very, very blueberry forward, and that's just fine. We like blueberries. And then one last time, we're going to fold up the edges. And these turns are more than just getting in the ingredients. These turns are also giving us the different layers inside of the scones that build tension. And that tension in turn will create that really nice rise that we're looking for. Now, we've got our blueberries in. And now we want to round it out. And we want to push down and turn that into about 7 inches in diameter. This work surface is wonderful. It has pre-made marks here for how many inches. This is an 8-inch circle, so we just need to go about an inch smaller. And now we have our 7-inch circle, and this is about 1.5 inches high. What we're going to do is we're going to cut these into quarters, and then again, so that we get 8 equal pie-shaped wedges. But before we do that, I wanted to talk about these creases and these little bubbles and imperfections. That is what we're looking for. We want the little nooks and crannies. Before we cut these, we need to get them chilled back down again so that they won't spread apart in the baking process. So we're going to get our pre-lined baking sheet that we did earlier and get that right onto the sheet. And we're going to pop that into the freezer for about 10 minutes. And when we come back, just about to come up to temperature, and it's time to glaze and cut the scones into their final shapes. To do that, we can just eyeball it, or if you want to be really, really precise, you can use a baker's ruler like this and draw score lines. You just push down. So we have a cross, and then you just want to make another cross, but it will look like it's on the diagonal. So we'll just go across again and across again, and this will give us the 8 scones that we need. First, I'm going to glaze them with just icy cold heavy cream, making sure to get all the way down the sides. It will splatter as it's doing here, not a big deal. Again, scones are not something that we are looking for uniformity in. Okay, we're going to cut those now with our pastry cutter straight down the center. And we'll do it again. And then again, straight across, and then again. And then let's just lift that out. Beautiful. Lift that out. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Our oven has just now come to temperature. We want to make sure that these are about 2 inches apart. And I'm going to give it just one last brush on the top, just so it kind of drizzles a little bit. But what you're looking for when you cut them is that very sticky dough that has those very ragged sides, because we don't want them to be clean sides. We want them to be all bubbly and full of nooks and crannies. And now I have our vanilla sugar, and I'm just going to pop that right on top, as much or as little as you want. You don't want so much that it burns, but there's nothing like having a nice crunch on the top of these. Now we'll have to look at them again and decide, are they room temperature or are they still cold? I think because I have been filming under these lights, I think it's probably best if I pop these right back into the freezer again for another 5 minutes, just to get it all solidified again. So when we come back, we'll be ready to pop them in the oven. It's been about 10 minutes and our scones are super chilled and ready to go into the oven. I'm going to set a timer for 10 minutes, and then I'm going to rotate the scones 180 degrees just so that they completely bake evenly on all sides. And then once we have that oven open, I'll be able to determine will they need another 5 or 10 minutes longer. These should take about 20 minutes total, but if you're using a convection oven, as I am here today, they may just be done a little bit sooner. So when we come back, we'll check them out, rotate them, and be ready to finish the baking process. We have about 30 seconds left before we have to rotate the pan. Let's talk about the last few steps that we'll need to do in order to get our scones ready to take out of the oven. We'll have standing by a cooling rack, a couple of trivets to put the hot pan on. I have an offset spatula to pick them up, and of course I have a oven mitt that we'll use right now to rotate the pan. We have about 10 seconds left. I've gone ahead and I've turned the light on. They have puffed beautifully. Before I rotate them, I'll bring them closer to the camera so you can see what they look like. Ooh, my glasses got all fogged up. So they are puffing up beautifully. Now it's time to do that last rotation. They are lightly browned, so I think that's going to take another 5 to 6 minutes. So let's go ahead and set the timer for 5 minutes. And when we come back, we should have golden brown puffy scones ready to be enjoyed with our rose petal jam. It took about 6 minutes rather than 5 minutes to get these to the deep golden brown that I was looking for. Let's go ahead and turn one over. They're nice, not soggy on the bottom, no soggy bottom here. And I want to get these off of the cookie sheet as quick as possible because I don't want them to continue the baking process. So let's get these off. Some people like to eat these scones warm. I actually like them room temperature with clotted cream and with the rose petal jam that we made earlier today. I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial and our first little foray into using the ingredients that we gather from around the world.